Watch to the end of the video for an important announcement regarding Subscriber Appreciation Month and to see what game I'll be covering next month. Over the past 4 decades, Nintendo has released a lot of games that can be considered culturally and historically significant to gaming history. From the importance of Rob the Robot and reviving the home consoles after the gaming crash, the first steps in modern game design facilitated by Super Mario Bros., all the way to the impact that Super Smash Bros. Ultimate will have in people's lives. Nintendo has always been extremely influential to gaming culture. One of the reasons I haven't talked about Nintendo directly on this channel before is that, well, Nintendo has made it very clear they really don't have any interest in preserving their own history, and are fairly adamant about others not doing so either. However, today there is one game that I need to talk about. One that has been incredibly influential to me, and one that, when it was released on October 26 in the year 2000, I doubt even Nintendo might have realized just how important it was. In the 1990s, during the second bit war fought between Sony, Sega, and Nintendo, consoles were just starting to explore a new dimension to their games. The Z-axis was becoming something of a mainstay in gaming. 3D certainly wasn't new. Nintendo themselves was already pushing the envelope with games like Star Fox or Stunt Racer FX on the Super Nintendo. But it wasn't until the 5th generation of consoles that 3D went from something of a novelty to something expected. Many games tried to figure out how to transition their formerly 2D series into the 3rd dimension with mixed results, but even these growing pains were ultimately formative to modern game design. However, something that wasn't really explored was the 4th dimension, time. Alright, yeah, time technically existed in every game, but there wasn't many games that really had thought about the concept of time as a gameplay mechanic. For the most part, games don't really care about time. Whether it takes you 2 hours or 20 hours to beat the game, time never really seems to be a factor. Sure, there are some games that feature a day-night cycle. There are some games that even have the concept of seasons. There were games like Chrono Trigger that was all about traveling through different eras, and the Magic of Scheherazade that explored the concept even before then. Nintendo's own The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time even dabbled in the concept of going forwards and backwards through 2 different periods of time. The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask was unique though. Time wasn't considered just a variant state. An instance where some things were different during the day than they were at night, or how the past was different from the future. Instead, it did something that very few games had explored, an unstoppable march forward in time towards an ultimate finality, where your demise looms both metaphorically and literally over your shoulders, as a reminder of what little time you have left. It was a concept so incredibly interwoven in its theme that it didn't only pervade the games in terms of narrative or gameplay, but nearly every aspect about it, down to its very marketing. The end result was an entry that stands at odds with most other games in this series in terms of themes and tone, and explored that in a way that very few games had managed, making it one of the most memorable experiences ever featured in a Zelda title, if not of all gaming. This is Building Character, an in-depth look at some of the greatest moments in gaming, and you can say it's about time I talk about The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. Their passion for games is only rivaled by their need of sustenance. As you know, I am a big fan of Humble Bundle. It's a way you can grab and discover not only just a lot of great games, but also software, comics, role-playing books, and more, all the while supporting your favorite charities. And as a humble partner, it's a great way for you to support the channel and not have to pay anything extra. Even if you wanted to give me money directly, I still recommend others grab a Humble Bundle instead. However, you probably know this already. But what you might not know is Humble Bundle is changing how they're doing their Humble Monthly, changing it to Humble Choice. So instead of getting a bunch of games that you might not be interested in, you get to choose what you want. It's a multi-tiered service, meaning the more you pay, the more choices you get. However, if you were subscribed to Humble Monthly before December 6, you were part of their Classic tier, which gives you a lot of benefits even over their Premium tier for a cheaper cost than their Basic tier. If you're not already a member, you can use the link in the description below and Humble Bundle will throw 10 of your $12 subscription my way. Not only that, but you also get Yakuza Kiwami, Soul Calibur 6, and My Time in Portia, plus many more to be unlocked in December, which is a crazy good deal. And you get to keep those games forever whether you're subscribed or not. Remember though, you only have until December 6th to sign up, so don't wait. Alright, enough with this shilling, on with the video. Majora's Mask was not your traditional Zelda title. For starters, it doesn't take place in Hyrule, doesn't have you go against Ganon or involve the Triforce. It doesn't even have the titular Zelda in it. Well, not really anyway. Making this video surprisingly relevant to the modern day, Majora's Mask is actually more similar to Link's Awakening, and they would have a lot more in common than just their stories. Both weren't exactly born like many other entries in the series. Link's Awakening didn't start as an official Zelda title, but instead got its start as an after-hours project. Originally just a tech demo of what a Zelda game could have been on the Game Boy, but its development continued to grow until it became an official title. Link's Awakening would step away from the story of trying to save Hyrule from Ganon, and instead would focus on an incredibly unique and surprisingly poignant narrative about a strange island with an egg resting on a mountain. It ended up being a huge success for fans, critics, and even the staff itself. Despite stating that they felt like they were making a parody of a Zelda game, series director and producer Eiji Aonuma said it was the first time that he thought a Legend of Zelda game had a proper plot. The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask would have been born in a similar fashion. After the success of Ocarina of Time, the development staff really struggled with how to follow that up. Nintendo had invested a lot of money and time into Ocarina's 3D engine, and they wanted to make use of it to create another Zelda game without having to spend a lot of resources. Series creator Shigeru Miyamoto wanted to make what he called Ura Zelda, or what would be known as Master's Quest for the ill-fated Nintendo 64 disk drive. Ura Zelda was pitched as the second quest, or B-side to Ocarina of Time, featuring remixed and more challenging dungeons through what would be more or less the same game. Eiji Aonuma, who was at the time Ocarina's dungeon designer, wasn't exactly excited about the idea of simply remixing the dungeons. I felt changing around the puzzle solving without changing the overall structure was too limiting. Aonuma turned down the offer to work on Ura Zelda, saying he was only interested in making a new Zelda game. Shigeru Miyamoto wasn't exactly pleased, having scolded Aonuma for being the lazy kind of guy who would jump to conclusions before even giving something a try. But despite that, not only did Miyamoto let him work on another Zelda project, but gave him the director's seat. Miyamoto only had a few stipulations. Mainly because Ocarina of Time had taken such a long time to develop, he wanted the next game to be produced quickly within about a year. Making a fully complete game within a year's time isn't an easy feat. Eiji Aonuma realized he couldn't make a game on this same scale as Ocarina of Time. To save even more time on production, they would use a lot of the same character models and assets found in Ocarina, and even their very concepts such as making the Skull Kid and a Happy Mask Salesman, both who were minor characters in Ocarina and would just end up giving them bigger roles. The other solution was, instead of making a game that was as large as Ocarina, they would focus on making the experience more dense, focusing more on a smaller area with more of an emphasis on the story. Aware that they would have to focus more on the game's narrative, Aonuma had brought on the person who had crafted Link's Awakening's narrative, Yoshiaki Koizumi. Originally wanting to be a film director, Koizumi first started Nintendo as an illustrator, his work being found in the manuals of Link to the Past and Super Mario Kart. He was brought on to create the illustrations to Link's Awakening as well, but as development progressed in that game, he found himself more active in the game's development, such as helping with boss designs, writing the game's script, and designing the story. Aonuma appreciated Koizumi's work so much that he wanted him to create the narrative for what was known at the time of development as Zelda Gaiden, or Zelda Side Story. Yoshiaki Koizumi, alongside Shigeru Miyamoto, both came up with the idea of the 3-day system. As Eiji explained,
Now, it's true that we changed the entire game system in Majora's Mask into a 3-day time system. This idea actually stemmed from the thought that we could perhaps take the time passage system we introduced in Ocarina of Time and find a way to flesh it out more.
But rather than a broad expanse of time, such as seeing the difference in the world between a span of 7 years like you did in Ocarina, you would see the events unfold within 3 days, using the Ocarina of Time to travel between those days. For the project, it meant that different events could happen in the same area at different times, giving a lot of opportunities for events and puzzles without having to create a lot of assets. As development continued, Koizumi would continue to expand on the story. Similar to Miyamoto, he would draw inspiration from real-life experiences and figure out how to translate those experiences into a game, though Koizumi tended to focus more on surreal thoughts he had. I would look up at the moon and think about what would happen if the moon started to fall towards Earth. It was this idle thought that gave birth to the idea of the main threat in Zelda Gaiden, and why Link would only have 3 days. Since there was a discussion about making masks more important in this game, he thought about the game's antagonist being possessed by a mask, and the game's mechanic of switching masks to take various forms, ultimately leading into the game's title, Majora's Mask. Though Majora's Mask didn't exactly meet the deadline that Shigeru Miyamoto had wanted, the game's development being about a year and 8 months. Thankfully, Miyamoto said his famous line about delayed games, and the completed project ended up being a success for Nintendo. Though that's only if you don't really compare it to Ocarina. It wouldn't surpass Ocarina of Time or even Link's Awakening, selling only 3 million copies compared to Ocarina's 7.5 million. It also wouldn't be quite as critically praised as Ocarina of Time, scoring lower in reviews. Even to this day, it is often overshadowed by its predecessor. In terms of legacy, Ocarina of Time will always be remembered as the game that brought Zelda into the third dimension, and created the formula that would influence the series for decades. But while Majora's Mask might not be as popular and arguably not as culturally impactful as Ocarina of Time, despite it always being an Ocarina shadow, it was never too far behind either. It was consistently rated as one of the best games of all time by several gaming magazines and sites, even winning the Game FAQ's fan-voted Game of the Decade, even beating out other entries in the series like Twilight Princess and Wind Waker. For a lot of fans, Majora's Mask is considered one of the best games in the series, if not one of the best games ever released by Nintendo. And since it's not really that much different from Ocarina of Time in terms of graphics or gameplay, and is even considered to have a smaller scope, a lot of that weight was pulled by the game's narrative. Majora's Mask, for example, was a major departure from the games that came before it. Not precisely for its story, but for its setting and tone. Let's not swing our sword around the bush here. The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask is dark. While the series was never a stranger to unnerving or dark implications in their games, Majora's Mask was quite possibly the first time in Nintendo's history that they ever reveled in it. Coming out of the 16-bit console wars, Nintendo had relaxed their very strict stance regarding censorship, allowing games that had graphic violence to finally appear on their consoles. Nintendo themselves, though, never really taken any steps closer to aging up their games for their maturing audience. Their games were still family-friendly affairs that handled most allusions to mature concepts in the same way as a children's show, usually using them in undertones but never really exploring them as themes or concepts. Majora's Mask, though, pardon my Hylian, but gets real. So much so that it inspired one of the most popular creepypastas, and had given weight to several fan theories about the real meaning behind the game's themes. These theories hold just enough merit that they can be seen as entirely plausible, but are just inaccurate and disregarding of the source material enough that game theory can make a video on it. However, for this episode, we're going to be speaking specifically how the game tells its narrative. The story itself is quite simple. After the events of Ocarina of Time, Link goes on a journey to find a friend, implied to be Navi. On his journey, he comes across a Skull Kid wearing a strange mask, who ends up cursing Link by turning him into a Deku scrub, which is pretty terrible because at that time, being a scrub was the worst thing you can be. Link soon finds he's in a land called Termina, and discovers that the moon is going to crash down in 3 days. Before that happens, Link must visit a specified number of shrines, beat a specified number of bosses by gaining various items found in that dungeon, do side missions for minor items to help him on his quest, and defeat Majora to save the land of Termina. And he completely forgets about Navi. Yeah, like, not to spoil anything, it never comes up again. That's always thought that was weird. Anyway, admittedly, despite the change of its more traditional elements, the story is your typical Zelda game. But as the usual case on building character, it's not the story the game tries to tell, it's how the game tells its story. There is just so much to hit on with Majora's Mask that, to be completely honest, I don't even know where to start. Every corner of Termina is filled with a narrative theme, typically one of regret, loss, and sorrow. From a Goron filled with despair of his own death, and his regret for being unable to save his village from a cursed, unending winter, to the regret of Azora being unable to save his lover's eggs, and his lover being so stricken by grief that she symbolically lost her will to live. Or spending all 3 days left in a game trying to reunite two lovers, succeeding and bearing witness to their exchange of vows, mere hours before the moon falls, destroying Termina and certainly them. To an angry Deku King who wants to boil a monkey alive, to a grief-stricken caretaker after his sister meets with a terrible fate. It's harder to find a part of the game that isn't just ready to stab you in the gut emotionally. Ironically, what makes it more effective is the fact that Majora's Mask discusses all these themes without explicitly saying anything about them. It shows, but it goes out of its way to never tell, almost as if dancing around the edges of the topic. This was entirely intentional. Yoshiaki Koizumi has been on the record that he tries to sneak narrative elements past his boss. So there's never a moment that is as overt as something like Silent Hill 2, where despite its symbolism, it's pretty apparent with its theme. Majora's Mask is far more subtle in comparison. It's telling you the story almost entirely in subtext. You're playing a Zelda game complete with the, at times, goofy characters and silly side quests. Some that are especially familiar if you played Ocarina of Time, but there is just something that seems off about it. And this isn't just about sneaking crap past the radar. This form of storytelling goes a long way in making the game feel creepy and unnerving. It's the strange sensation of something being normal on the surface, but things seeming wrong underneath. But because no one is mentioning it, acting as if this is completely normal, you start questioning if even you should bring it up. However, while all that is definitely worth mentioning, which is why I mentioned it, it's not exactly what makes Majora's Mask an effective narrative. Really, the reputation of it being the mature Zelda game, in a way, feels like it's doing the game a disservice. What is probably the most important aspect of the game isn't the dark themes or tones it explores, but rather the most overt and obvious part of its narrative. And more importantly, how it accomplishes this by using one of the most encompassing elements found in Majora's Mask, and also one of the game's biggest threats: time. As mentioned before, Majora's Mask is a game that's on a time limit. You have 3 in-game days in order to stop the moon from crashing into Termina. Each day is about 20 minutes long, giving you roughly an hour to finish your quest, and you can extend that by playing a song which slows the flow of time, so each day is about an hour or around 40 minutes in the 3DS version. You can also travel back to the dawn of the first day by playing the Song of Time, though by doing so you lose all your consumable items and progress towards any quest you are doing resets. But no matter what you do, there is nothing that can stop the flow of time. It's always constantly progressing towards the demise of Termina. Time limits in themselves are nothing new to video games. They are a very common way to add a lot of tension to a scene. Including them makes everything immediately more tense and stressful. Every action holds more value and the progression of time is much more noticeable. And it's a reason why they're so popular. Super Mario Bros. Had a timer for each level. Metroid is known for its recurring self-destruct sequence escape scenes. And if you ever played the Sonic the Hedgehog game, you probably have minor PTSD anytime you see an underwater level. Once that drowning theme kicks in, your heart begins to race. You can no longer take your time. And for a game that wasn't really all that punishing, suddenly makes every jump matter, every enemy more dangerous. Each passing second becomes more and more valuable than the last as you either breathe a sigh of relief or you... This sort of anxiety is often why a lot of games don't use time limits, or why designers at least limit them to particular scenes. They often create a negative experience for the player simply because the added stress can take away the enjoyment of the game. In fact, the original Fallout had a time limit that was removed via a later patch simply because players heavily demanded it. Because time limits are such a negative experience, many games will simply give you an arbitrary time limit, but there's nothing mechanically honoring that. Or if there is, it's such a generous time limit that there's no way the player would conceivably exceed it unless they were actively trying. It's the benefit of adding a threat of a deadline without really creating the negative experience that accompanies it. You especially wouldn't expect it in a Zelda game since a lot of the player's enjoyment and the game itself is usually built around the idea of player exploration. It's about looking for secret areas, searching for collectibles, or doing the myriad of mini-games available. The player is actively rewarded for exploration with heart pieces and other items. Once you put a time limit on top of all that, suddenly the player isn't as incentivized to go explore, and could be potentially punished for doing so. On the surface, this seems like it would be considered by video game analysts potentially desperate for hate clicks as bad game design. But I feel a more accurate term for this is dissonant game design, where gameplay mechanics are not harmonious with each other. A common example of this is a game where the mechanics allow you to move incredibly fast and the gameplay requires you to, then punishes you at every opportunity for going too fast by having you run into enemies and obstacles you can't react to. And that certainly could be considered bad game design. However, dissonant design isn't inherently bad. In fact, sometimes it's required to intentionally make something a negative experience in order to serve a greater purpose. And it's that design that makes Majora's Mask so memorable. Majora's Mask, for all its dark tones and themes presented throughout the narrative, the one that appears the most is time. Or, more accurately, the despair that is born from the constant forward progression of time. Or, put more simply, meeting a terrible fate. Nearly every aspect of Majora's Mask is designed to echo this theme. The monkey faces his trial and him being dipped in a vat of boiling water. The Goron village facing freezing and starvation with the death of the town's hero. Everyone is facing an inevitable despair that looms ever closer. It's no accident that Terminus shares its name with Terminal, a stage of a disease predicted to be incurable, ending in death. There are many examples of this found in Majora's Mask, but the best example is the place that is the literal center of it all. At the start of your adventure and on the dawn of the first day, you arrive in Clocktown, named after, the town's clock. The moon lingers overhead, looming down and staring at you. The townspeople are very well aware of its descent, but really, for the most part, they don't seem all that bothered by it. They continue on their daily lives, talking as if the moon was just the latest gossip in town. The only person with a real concern is the town guard who's wishing to evacuate people. But even then, there is opposition to that thought. A group of carpenters deny the threat even exists, believing that continuing with the town's traditional festival is more important. I mean, it almost seems ridiculous. I mean, imagine a forthcoming extinction level event where there are people denying it outright as fake news just so they can continue to make money from their jobs. It's a good thing video games allow us to explore things that would never happen in real life. But really, it does lull you into a false sense of security. You have 3 whole days, and that's plenty of time to do the things that you need to do. It isn't until the second day that you might notice something is off. You might not even be aware of what, but there is a subtle shift in how the characters interact that makes everything seem a bit more on edge. The majority of people are still around, but now they're a bit more anxious and speak with a sense of uncertainty. There's a greater sense of urgency to get things done, to wrap up the things they wish to accomplish. Even the town's music, which was calm and peaceful on the first day, like your traditional Zelda town song, ends up feeling a bit more rushed on the second day. Then on the final day, there is no chill. Most of the NPCs have evacuated, leaving behind a mostly empty town. The few that do remain are facing their own existential crisis, lamenting their hubris of waiting at the last moment. Termina sporadically trembles with either fear or orbitally induced tectonic shifts, which is only made more ominous if you happen to have a rumble pack inserted. The town theme still has a melody, but it's lost all pretense, completely filled with dissonant accompaniment, as if the song itself doesn't have time to hit the right notes, making it all too aware that you are out of time. It makes you question if you even had enough of it to begin with. One of the incredibly smart design decisions of Majora's Mask is that it effectively makes you play the first cycle in its entirety just to get a sense of how stressful this is. There is no way to slow down time or even save within your first hour of gameplay, just so you can witness it coming down to the final moments and feel the very real risk of the world ending. Even in the subsequent loops, it doesn't really stop. Each leg of your adventure just shows another part of Termina being affected by the moon falling, such as the young Romani being allowed to drink Chateau Romani on the final day, something that the game strongly alludes to being alcoholic, her sister effectively getting her drunk before the end of the world, so she doesn't have to experience the horrific events. Meanwhile, you're never really safe yourself. There is really no escape save restarting the process over, repeating the same events and watching the world loop again and again. The game encourages you to do as much as you can to push that timer down to the last day. Suddenly, even the things you can do in Zelda to kill time have a lot more meaning because more often than not, you don't have time to kill. You find yourself making decisions on whether or not you feel comfortable looking for potential secrets. Mini-games, once a stress relief in the series, has more of a cost than just rupees now. It takes time, and failure carries with it a much greater consequence because it costs you even more time. It's always there, never stopping and never ending. This can seem overwhelming, and honestly, it kinda is. I know people that had a difficult time enjoying Majora's Mask because of how stressful it is, and that is perfectly valid. I mean, here you are with the weight of the moon on your shoulders, a constant reminder of just how limited your time is, surrounded by narratives of death and failure in every corner. Even if you do act as a surrogate and solve the NPC's various issues, there's a good chance that you'll end up undoing everything you worked for because you were trying to avoid your own terrible fate. It's a pretty miserable experience at times. It's especially jarring because it's a Nintendo game. They have almost never made a game that was dark or depressing, with them famously on the record of saying that,
"If it's not fun, why bother?"
But there are times when creating a stressful or negative experience can be beneficial to the game. The reason why the escape sequence in Metroid exists isn't to punish the player. It isn't just a timer, it's also the falling debris, the screen shaking and tilting, and everything else it can do to make the scene more tense. But as stressful as this can be, it ultimately wants the player to succeed. It's to create a high-tension situation so there can be a cathartic release once you successfully escape. When you escape that exploding base, you feel a greater sense of accomplishment than you would simply being told there was a self-destruct sequence and then it just continues on as normal. Majora's Mask is doing the same thing but on a much bigger scale. Narrative design means more than just telling you the game's story through cutscenes. It's often about using every aspect of the game, the narrative, the game's themes, its tone, the dialogue, the characters, the music, the sound effects and visual cues, the user interface, the game's mechanics, the rumble feature. Even the game's marketing was used in a way to invoke the same sense of dread and tension in the player.
Hello, caller.
Hello?
Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Go ahead. We're listening.
I just...
Believe in the boy.
Mom, I love you. And Dad, I miss you. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I hope that kid wins. I really do.
It uses what you think a Zelda game is and turns that against you. Majora's Mask effectively weaponized nearly every aspect of a game they could for this purpose. not just to tell a story, but to make you feel part of that story. That stress is a real, tangible feeling being felt by the players. They aren't just being told how the characters feel, they can empathize because they feel that anxiety as well. But it doesn't do this with any intention to punish you. Despite the stress of the constantly ticking timer, you're really never in any danger of the moon falling. The player always has a chance to escape, always a way to make things right and to correct past mistakes. Speaking strictly from a design perspective, this never puts the player in an unwinnable situation. They might be pushed, but they're never punished for making mistakes. This differs a lot from games with strict time limits where every failure counts against you. Likewise, each loop isn't meant to keep you trapped in an endless cycle. You will never be able to do everything in 3 days, but it doesn't expect you to. Instead, it's designed so that you learn a little more each time, that you get a little further, that you gain the tools that you need, that each time the stress affects you a little less and you gain more confidence and familiarity about what you are doing. Until after a while, it doesn't even bother you at all. That in itself might seem dissonant to the game's goal of trying to build up this cataclysmic, seemingly inevitable event. Functionally, it could be said that it's there to make sure that the narrative design isn't hostile to the player, but really, it's completely harmonious to the game's narrative. Majora's Mask isn't doing this to simply be dark and edgy. It's not trying to be the cool or mature Zelda game. Despite the dark tones, the illusion of death, failure, and regret, and the theme of meeting with a terrible fate, the game itself is about having hope and healing. Every scene that contains a darker element always carries with it a way to absolve that darkness. Wherever there is despair, there is also hope. Wherever there is pain, there is also healing. Really, the only reason why Majora's Mask might be considered the darkest Zelda game is because it tries to shine the brightest light. And that's not to say it's unique in that regard. Nearly every story has a conflict and resolution. Whereas many games will simply use its plot to build empathy, what makes Majora's Mask so special isn't that it's just telling the player the story, but making them part of it. Majora's Mask uses its dissonant design to cause very real anxiety only so the player can feel the anxiousness fade and replace itself with confidence. It exposes the player to situations that might make them uncomfortable or sad, only so they can feel the same sense of joy when there is a spark of happiness found. The simple story arcs found in a game become surprisingly powerful just because you're emotionally invested. But what makes it even more potent is that Majora's Mask is also a very personal narrative. I have to admit something, when I first played Majora's Mask, I was about 13 years old. And when I played it back then, I genuinely did not like it. Mainly for the same criticism against the game's time mechanic and, more petty, the fact that you were playing as young Link. The story of the moon falling and its depressing themes didn't hold the same appeal to me as fighting Ganon and saving Hyrule. It wasn't until a decade later until I learned to appreciate it. It wasn't because I understood or respected the game's design more, or that I suddenly seen games as art instead of entertainment. It was because I had gained more life experience. The same anxiety I had with the moon falling and the empathy I felt with the struggles of the characters had mirrored experiences I had felt in my own life. That pain of knowing someone who is terminal and you weren't sure how much time they had left, only that it was running out. Pain that existed from events beyond your control. Times where you screwed something up and you wish you could just go back in time and fix it. It was these very real and very personal experiences that I had struggled with that were alluded to in the game. And the more fortunate young Sober who never had these experiences couldn't appreciate it. But dealing with these struggles in Majora's Mask tells the player that there is no such thing as being too late to do something. That even failure doesn't stop you from doing better next time. That even among that failure, you never have to live with regret. That there is always a means to heal. That anxiety through repetition and exposure could be overcome. That even if you meet with a terrible fate, a parting is sure to follow. Majora's Mask ends up being both an entertaining game, complete with all the escapism and things you can't do in real life, all the while being something that is more than a game. It teaches you lessons that you can take with you in real life. It's hard to say that whether we'll ever have a game that's similar to Majora's Mask. Eiji Aonuma since then has become the lead producer for the Zelda series, though he hasn't taken the role of director since Twilight Princess, long considered to be the other Dark Zelda game. He admitted since Majora's Mask was his first game, he didn't really want to revisit it for the 3DS remake, which honestly is understandable because anytime you look at your early work, it's hard to look at. While Yoshiaki Koizumi has gone from a simple illustrator for manuals to the producer of the recent Mario games, including Super Mario Odyssey. Both of them are very prominent figures at Nintendo, so maybe, but probably not. But even if we don't, part of the appeal of Majora's Mask is because it is so different than your typical Legend of Zelda. Majora's Mask will be turning 20 years old, and despite its heavy focus on the impermanence of time, itself has remained timeless. Well, the limitations of the Nintendo 64 aside. But despite the fact that it was created in an early era of 3D, and that it might have been the most rushed game in the series, it still remains a fan favorite among many. Most likely because the game resonated with them as well. After all, Majora's Mask allows the player to explore their own personal experiences, and in turn, build character. Hey, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Here's the part where I normally show my channel, but today I have a pretty special announcement. If you've been a long-time viewer of the channel, you know that December is Subscriber Appreciation Month, and that means it's time to vote on what you would like to see covered for SAM 2019. Voting is simple. All you have to do is click in the Google form in the description below, and when you see the prompt, enter your choice. If you want, you can fill out the optional feedback on the channel and you're done. No long survey this year, no multi-tier voting, and the winner will be chosen at random so everyone has a chance to win. You don't technically even have to be subscribed to enter, but, you know, it's kind of Subscriber Appreciation Month, and, you know, if you could subscribe, it would be appreciated. I do this as a way to say thank you to those who enjoy the content and have supported the channel. Subscriber Appreciation Month is just a small gesture for everyone who has done so much for me over the years. As for the next video, we'll be keeping it in the realm of Nintendo with Super Mario RPG: The Legend of the Seven Stars, as chosen by those who have supported me on Patreon. Speaking of which, I want to give a special thank you to those who go out of their way to give so selflessly to the channel. I'm not gonna lie, there have been a lot of changes over the past year and many more to come. And I simply wouldn't be able to do any of this without their support. So give a moment to look at the people who make all of this possible. If you'd like to consider supporting the channel, you have quite a wide variety of options available to you. Supporting through Patreon or YouTube membership, using my humble partner link, following me on Twitter or Twitch, clicking that bell, or even just leaving a comment. No matter what you do, it always helps. And know that even though Subscriber Appreciation Month is just once a year, I appreciate all of you all year round. Also, I want to give a quick shout out to Julia Henderson and her amazing Majora's Mask renditions. Seriously, she has some incredible video game covers of both Zelda and Chrono Trigger. And it's a crime that she has less subs than I do, so please check her out.